In the yellowed archives of Baxter County, Arkansas, there is a short note written in the margin of a 1902 police report that has never been officially explained. Just 4 words, written in graffiti that has faded with time. Followed the sisters. There are no full names, no signature, no conclusion. Just this dry observation, lost among records of overdue taxes and incomplete death certificates. It is from this almost invisible line that one of the most disturbing episodes ever documented along the old Ozark Trail begins. Between 1898 and 1901, 41 men disappeared in the vicinity of Cold Peak Trail, a little-used route used by loggers, traveling salesmen, small farmers, and seasonal workers who crossed the hills of northern Arkansas in search of temporary employment. None of them returned. No bodies were officially recovered. No formal confessions were recorded. What exists are fragments, broken testimonies, church notebooks, letters interrupted mid-sentence, and repeatedly, the same vague reference, almost always whispered, the Sisters of Cold Peak. Cold Peak was not a town, but a high point on the trail, a fold of land surrounded by dense forests, where the wind rarely ceased. 3 women lived there, recorded in the census only as the daughters of a miner who had died years before. Their names appear inconsistently in the documents, in some records as Eleanor, Ruth, and Miriam, in others simply as the 3 sisters. They never married. They never had officially recognized children. They lived together on an isolated property, far enough away not to attract attention, but close enough to be unavoidable to those passing by on the trail. Reports describe the house as old, built even before the county was consolidated. Wood darkened by moisture. Low roof. Windows always closed, even during the summer. There was an underground annex, mentioned only in old mining plans, which few claim to have actually seen. A space carved into the rock, originally used to store tools and dynamite, known on maps as the binding chamber. At first, the sisters were seen as eccentric but harmless figures. They offered water, sometimes hot food, a place to rest from the sudden cold that descended from the hills at dusk. In times of harsh winter, when the trail became almost impassable, many accepted the invitation to stay there for a few hours. Some, according to later testimonies, stayed all night. People who knew them superficially said they spoke little. They observed too much. They had a habit of listening in silence, as if every word spoken by travelers was carefully measured. They did not ask direct questions, but led the conversation with short phrases that led the other person to say more than they intended. A subtle, almost invisible method. As the months passed, people began to disappear. A woodcutter who never made it to camp. A salesman who never returned to his hometown. A contract worker who simply stopped writing to his family. At first, the disappearances were treated as common accidents in the region. Falls, animal attacks, disorientation in the woods. But when the names began to pile up, something changed. In a record book from the Mountain Home Baptist Church, there is a torn page, preserved only because it was stuck to the spine. On it, a pastor wrote, "They said they stopped at the sister's house. They said the wind was too strong to continue." Just below, there is a long pause, marked by a deep scratch on the paper, as if the hand had hesitated before continuing. Subsequent censuses show something even stranger. While dozens of men disappeared along the trail, the sisters' property remained untouched. No debts, no disputes, no official inspections recorded, as if the place were beyond the normal reach of the authorities, or beyond their interest. The last confirmed disappearance occurred in the winter of 1901. A group of 3 workers was seen entering the trail at dawn. Only one of them was seen again, hours later, talking briefly with residents of a nearby village. According to the testimony, he mentioned that they intended to rest a little at Cold Peak. After that, his name never appeared again in any record. At this point, the archives fall silent. The investigations cease without formal explanation. The sisters continue to be mentioned but never accused. And among all the preserved documents, there is one detail that repeats itself with disturbing precision. None of the 41 men were seen leaving that property. To understand why so many men agreed to interrupt their route and stay at the Cold Peak property, it is necessary to abandon the modern idea of conscious choice and observe the reality of that time. At the end of the 19th century, the Ozark Trail was not just a physical path, it was a territory of constant human wear and tear. Men traveled alone for days, sometimes weeks, crossing regions where cold weather could strike without warning. Food was scarce, and communication with the outside world simply disappeared after the last known town. Records show that most of the 41 missing men shared a similar profile. They were temporary workers with no fixed property, many widowed or single, some new to the state, men who carried with them little more than tools, worn clothes, and folded letters in their pockets. People whose absence would take weeks, sometimes months, to be officially noticed. The travel diaries found in abandoned camps along the trail describe the same deep exhaustion, not just physical, but emotional. The prolonged silence, the loneliness, the basic human need to be seen, heard, welcomed even by strangers. In this context, the sisters' house appeared as an unlikely respite amid the isolation. The routine of the three women, as reconstructed from indirect testimonies, was methodical and almost unchanging. They woke up before dawn. They kept the property organized despite its age. They planted small gardens resistant to the cold. They collected water at the same time every day. They did not go to the market regularly. When they did, they bought only what was necessary: salt, kerosene, coarse flour. They were never seen negotiating prices or arguing over costs. Residents of nearby villages reported that the sisters rarely raised their voices. They spoke slowly, in short sentences, always looking directly at the listener. They showed no hurry. They did not offer long explanations. This behavior, far from seeming hostile, conveyed a strange sense of control and stability. To men accustomed to the chaos of the road, it sounded like security. There is a specific testimony recorded in 1903 by a merchant named Henry Wallace, who visited the property only once. He describes that, upon arrival, he was greeted with a simple question: "Has the cold already begun to penetrate your bones?" According to him, the phrase did not sound like kindness, but like a statement of fact, as if they knew exactly the physical condition of those who arrived, even before hearing the answer. The house had few rooms accessible to visitors. A main room, always heated by a cast-iron stove. A large table with deep marks from long use. Wooden benches, all positioned on the same side, never in front of the windows. The rest of the building remained closed. Internal doors locked. Thick curtains. No visitor reported seeing the bedrooms or the basement, only hearing footsteps coming from under the floor at certain times of the day. The most revealing reports do not speak of immediate fear, but of delayed discomfort. Men who spent a few hours there mentioned a feeling that was difficult to name, as if time inside the house behaved differently. The wind outside seemed distant, the world beyond the trail irrelevant. Conversations stretched on without the passage of hours being noticed. In some accounts, clocks simply stopped being consulted. Another recurring point is the way the sisters conducted the rest. They never explicitly said stay. They only mentioned the cold that would increase after sunset, the trail that would become slippery, the distance to the next known shelter, always as neutral observations. The final decision seemed, to the travelers, entirely theirs. There are records of men who continued their journey after a brief stop. Curiously, these were the only ones who left written accounts of the place. Those who stayed longer, one night, according to the few indirect testimonies, were never seen again. There are no letters, no notes, no subsequent mention. One detail stands out in the testimonies of those who left. They all mention the same recommendation upon departure. A repeated phrase spoken by one of the sisters, never specified which: return by the clear path. Avoid the shortcut. The shortcut, according to maps of the time, passed exactly through the region where there were old abandoned mining excavations, including the so-called mooring chamber. Over time, local residents began to notice subtle patterns. Young men disappeared, older men rarely, small groups almost never. always lone travelers or pairs separated during the journey. There were never any reports of visible violence, no screams heard at night, no fights witnessed, just absence. In 1900, a traveling teacher wrote in a letter that was never sent, found years later among a cousin's belongings, "There are places that don't seem dangerous because they don't make noise, and people who don't need to threaten you to make you stay." It is this silent normality that makes the case so disturbing. Nothing in the sisters' daily lives indicated urgency, brutality, or disruption. Everything functioned within its own calm, almost domestic logic. And perhaps that is precisely why so many men agreed to walk through that door, sit at that table, and never return to the trail. The most detailed reconstruction of the disappearance in the archives takes place on the night of November 17th, 1901, not because it was different from the previous ones, but because, for the first time, someone left a clear enough timeline for the events to be organized with almost uncomfortable precision. The name on record is Thomas Elridge, 32 years old, a seasonal worker from Missouri. His name appears in 3 separate documents: a simple logging contract signed 2 days earlier, an entry in the meal log of a boarding house 15 miles from Cold Peak, and an indirect statement made by a local resident who saw him hours before his disappearance. After that silence, according to the reconstructed timeline, Thomas left the boarding house before dawn. Winter had arrived early that year. The air was dry and biting. The trail was covered with a thin layer of ice hidden under dead leaves. Weather reports from that time indicate a constant north wind, the kind that cuts through thick clothing and sticks to the body. Around noon, Thomas was seen by a local farmer, adjusting his backpack at the edge of the trail. They spoke briefly. The farmer reported that he seemed tired but lucid. He said only that he intended to stop a little further ahead. He did not mention his final destination, just rest. Records indicate that Thomas arrived at the sisters' property shortly before sunset. There are no direct witnesses to this moment, but there is a recurring description in previous accounts that allows us to reconstruct the scene with some accuracy. The wind abruptly dying down as he approached the house, as if the building created a natural shelter. The sound of the trail disappearing, the smell of old wood mixed with something metallic coming from underground. Inside the house, the lighting was minimal. Low lamps, long shadows on the walls. The stove already lit, despite the early hour. The table set as if expecting someone, although no one was announced. Thomas, according to previous standards, would have been invited to sit down, take off his coat, and warm his hands. No document mentions initial resistance on the part of the visitors. On the contrary, many report immediate relief. The night progressed slowly. The wind returned outside, now stronger, beating against the wood of the house at irregular intervals. A sound described in testimonies as similar to someone walking around the building, although there were no visible footsteps. Inside, the atmosphere remained controlled. The sisters spoke little. They observed more. Sometime after dinner, the existence of which is inferred from purchases recorded at the market days earlier, the last indirect mention of Thomas occurs. One specific detail appears in 3 separate accounts of other disappearances. The mention of a noise coming from under the floor. Not a crash, not a scream, just a dry, repeated sound, like something being dragged slowly over stone. It is at this point that the documents become disconcertingly vague. There is no description of a struggle. There is no mention of visible restraints. Only the recurring reference to a descent, never directly named. An old mining map indicates that, beneath the main room, there was a hidden access through a reinforced wooden door, originally used to transport heavy equipment to the mooring chamber. This chamber, according to technical records from the 1870s, was a narrow space, excavated directly into the rock, designed to immobilize large volumes of material during controlled detonations. It had iron rings fixed to the walls, still visible in inspections carried out years later. There is no official record that these rings were ever removed. The weather that night deteriorated rapidly. External witnesses report that the trail became virtually invisible after 8 p.m. Snow began to fall irregularly, mixed with mud. Any attempt to travel at night would be not only difficult but dangerous. This detail appears repeatedly in the testimonies. It was not a night to continue the journey. The last confirmed element emerges the following morning. A resident of the village of Norfolk reported seeing a man walking alone on the secondary road coming from the direction of Cold Peak. He had no backpack, no proper coat. He walked slowly, as if he were physically present but mentally distant. When questioned, he replied only that the others stayed behind. This man was never identified with certainty. His name does not appear in subsequent records. Some believe it was Thomas. Others claim that Thomas never left the property. What is known is that, after that date, no other travelers were officially seen entering the Cold Peak Trail for several months. Days later, local authorities made a cursory visit to the property. They found no visible signs of violence. The house was clean. The stove was cold. No male presence was recorded. Access to the basement was not inspected, citing structural instability. In the sheriff's files, there is only one line about this visit. Nothing unusual observed. Just below, someone wrote in different handwriting, "Silence does not prove absence." This was the last officially recognized disappearance. After that, the records cease. The sisters continue to appear in the censuses for a few more years, always on the same property, always described in the same way, until suddenly, their names are no longer listed. When the winter of 1901 gave way to the following spring, the Cold Peak Trail was no longer just a path avoided out of discreet superstition. It had become a space of recognized absence. Merchants stopped sending employees there. Local guides began to suggest long and safer detours. Even the most experienced men avoided crossing that region unaccompanied, not out of overt fear, but by silent consensus. The authorities' reaction was gradual and at first glance, bureaucratic. The disappearances began to be treated as individual occurrences, never as a whole. Each case had its own file, its own number, its own preliminary justification. Accident, voluntary escape, unpaid debt, personal problems. This administrative fragmentation diluted the seriousness of the pattern. Even so, some documents escaped this logic. In 1902, a county clerk gathered, on his own initiative, the names of all the men who had disappeared in the previous 3 years. The list contained 41 entries. Next to 27 of them was the same handwritten note. Last known stop, Cold Peak. The document was not officially attached to any investigation. It was kept among the clerk's personal papers, discovered only decades later. The testimonies collected from residents reveal a fear deeper than mere criminal suspicion. No one described the sisters as violent. No one spoke of screams or blood. What emerged was an unsettling perception of psychological control. People recalled conversations in which they felt led, not forced. A neighbor reported that when she tried to confront one of the women about the disappearances, she received only a long look and the phrase, "Some men don't know when it's time to leave." Small clues began to emerge over time. A hat found half a kilometer from the property, recognized by the wife of a missing man. A pocket watch recovered years later during a flood, with partially visible initials. None of these items were officially linked to the site, although they were all within the same geographical radius. The most compelling revelation came not through a confession, but from a technical report. In 1910, an engineer hired to assess old mining structures in the region was authorized to inspect the underground area beneath the sisters' former home, which had already been abandoned. The report mentions the existence of a narrow chamber with iron rings deeply embedded in the rock, some still marked by irregular wear, incompatible with common industrial use. There were no identifiable human remains. There were no preserved fabrics, only marks, old scratches, and an odor described as metallic and persistent, even years after the site was abandoned. The engineer did not proceed with deeper excavations, citing structural risk. The report was filed away without public repercussions. The sisters at that point were no longer there. Their names disappeared from official records after 1904. There are no death certificates. There are no records of change. They simply cease to exist in the archives. Some believe they died in isolation. Others suggest that they left quietly, just like the men who preceded them. What is understood today is that the revelation does not lie in a single act of violence, but in a system built over time, a silent method based on human reading, isolation, and opportunity. The sisters did not hunt. They waited. They watched. They created circumstances in which the decision to stay seemed rational, until there was no choice left. The 41 men did not disappear all at once. They were slowly erased one by one, within a domestic logic, almost invisible. And perhaps that is why the case was never officially solved. There was no spectacle. There was no traditional crime scene. Only accumulated silence. Decades later, when the maps were redrawn and the Ozark Trail lost its original function, Cold Peak came to exist only as a forgotten fold in the landscape. The house did not withstand the passage of time. The wood gave way. The roof caved in. The entrance to the basement was buried by successive landslides. Today, anyone passing through that region would hardly imagine that there was once a fixed point of human passage there, much less a silent center of disappearances. The files, however, remained fragmented, incomplete, stored in cardboard boxes, in county warehouses, in small libraries where dust accumulates faster than curiosity. It was in these documents that this case continued to breathe, not as a closed narrative, but as a set of gaps. What is most striking when rereading the records is not the absence of violent details, but the absence of interruption. For years, men disappeared without any real disruption to the local routine. The trail continued to be used. The market continued to sell groceries to the sisters. The churches continued to write names in their books. Normality remained intact, even as people ceased to exist. There is no definitive proof that the Cold Peak sisters directly caused the deaths of 41 men. What there is something more uncomfortable. The convergence of human decisions, geographical isolation, and institutional silence. An environment in which disappearing was not an extraordinary event, but an acceptable possibility. Over the decades, some historians have attempted to attribute the disappearances to natural factors. Others have pointed to undocumented conflicts. There are even those who argue that many of the men simply abandoned their previous lives. None of these theories, however, explain why so many were seen entering the same place, and none were seen leaving. The mooring chamber, now buried, has become a kind of unwitting symbol, not for what can be proven to have happened there, but for what can no longer be verified. The iron rings, mentioned in the technical report, are the last physical element connecting the space to the human stories that passed through it. A functional vestige in a place that should have been merely utilitarian. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this case is the absence of clear villains. The sisters left no manifestos, made no confessions, and did not engage in confrontations. They exist in the archives as constant, silent, almost administrative presences. Evil, if it can be called that, did not present itself as open violence but as routine. In the end, what remains are names. 41 of them, some complete, others reduced to initials. Men who followed a common path, accepted a plausible shelter, and disappeared within a sequence of decisions too small to seem fatal at the time. This account offers no definitive conclusion. It merely pieces together what time has allowed to be preserved. Perhaps this is precisely what keeps Cold Peak alive in historical memory, the impossibility of closing the case. Because there are places where nothing seems wrong, until someone fails to return. And sometimes, the silence that remains is the only record that survives.